I'm Lee Milan, and in this video we're going to look at distortion types within Ableton Live. So first, let's talk about distortion. Distortion is caused when we exceed the available volume headroom of an audio signal. So it can be desirable or undesirable, but we're talking about effects that deliberately use this process to create new sounds from something or add to the original sound. So let me show you what I mean by that. I'm just going to run over to one of the distortion units we have inside Ableton Live, which is called amp, and I'm just going to run a regular sine wave through it. So it's just a pure waveform that looks like an S on its side. It only has the original musical pitch information in there, no additional timbre, color, or frequencies. Okay, now if I add the distortion, all of a sudden we have these new harmonics that are being produced, and they give us a sense of presence or depth to a sound. So it lets us hear it maybe on smaller speakers. Something that's like this, a bass sound, might come across better because you can hear it both on big speakers with the bass and then on smaller speakers where we just hear the distortion harmonics coming through it too. So that's the main principles of distortion. We're basically trying to exceed the signal path, and when it hits the highest volume that signal path can take, it gets reshaped at the top, and there's different ways that that can be reshaped. So let's go through the main kind of classic distortion devices within Ableton Live, and by classic I mean classic styles of distortion. So this is an amp head. This is like a guitar amp and then cabinet, and there is a device called cabinet which can be coupled with this to create that combination. But we're not looking to create distorted guitars here. We're looking to use distortion as a general music production tool. So we don't necessarily want to kind of limit the frequency or the timbre shape of this by running it through a cabinet. We just want to use the distortion aspect to add new harmonics to our sound. So the key things we're looking for when we're using distortion is the distortion type itself, and then the actual input or the gain control, which will control how much distortion or how much that signal is getting turned up into that top ceiling will get reshaped when it gets to the top. So you can see the gain control can go from just subtle additional harmonics being added all the way into the point it's very brash, and there's a lot of mid to top information in there. Now we can always run this in parallel, so we can always use this dry wet control. So right now I can have the gain really high up on this, even have the EQs turned up, which will reshape and modify the actual sort of distortion color or tone of this, and then I can just start creeping in the distorted version alongside the original. So what would be a very extreme distortion can become a background sound to the foreground sound, which is the original signal. Okay, so that's the amp device, and we have a mono or dual mode as well. So if we wanted to detach ourselves from thinking like just a guitar being plugged through an amp and then being processed afterwards, we can put it in dual mode, and then it'll process both the left and right signals and retain the stereo information from our source sound. So drum bus is another device which has distortion built in. We've got a drive control here, and then this leads us to talking about how the waveform can be shaped when it hits that maximum headroom there. So we've got a soft mode, which is on at the moment. If I turn the drive up, we'll hear that kick in. If we change to medium and hard, you'll see how the top of the actual waveform gets shaped differently. So we basically have a different range of frequencies which are introduced when the wave is reshaped from going to the maximum headroom, and the volume of those frequencies also alters too. So hard clipping, you think of the sound being a bit harder in its tone, and then soft clipping being a bit more musical and a bit more kind of subtle with the distortion that it adds. We also have the crunch control, which further adds to the distortion effect. Most prominent here when it's set to medium in terms of the actual drive section as well. So that's drum bus, which is another distortion type. Now dynamic tube is something that basically allows us to distort in the characteristics of tube distortion, so vacuum tube devices using older technology. It was used a lot in the very early forms of musical studios, and it kind of created a sonic imprint which has continued to present day of a desirable tonality that we like out of our sort of sounds and distortion that we add. So dynamic tube, I'm just going to turn this up, the drive and the tone controls, and you'll start hearing it change the sound. There's a key difference to this one too. You'll note that when it plays here, the actual distortion isn't being applied to the top and the bottom part of the waveform. It's being applied to one or the other. So it's asymmetrical, not symmetrical. So that's a key characteristic of tube distortion, is that lack of symmetry to the distortion it's adding to your waveform. Okay, so we'll put that in context soon when we get through to the other stuff. Overdrive we have here, which has a filter band, so we can tune in the distortion to specific frequency areas. Drive control, so an amount of distortion, and then a tone control, which is how bright that distortion is allowed to get. And finally, we have a dynamic section, which either allows us to do no kind of compression to the signal, so dynamic control, controlling the availability, the possibility of high and low peaks. We can kind of squash that all together. It allows us to do that or not to our signal. And of course, we have a dry-wet control as well. Then we have pedal, which is modeled around guitar pedals, as is overdrive. And in context, the sort of classic guitar distortion pedal has been used countless times in many, many big tunes, or by very respectable artists, as a form of getting dirt and information into what might be some sterile sounds and get them to live and breathe a little bit more as well. So pedal gain control, we have 3 different distortion types, a 3-band EQ, and then we can choose the actual position of the mid one. So the bottoms and then the tops, and we choose where the mid goes up in the middle as well. Interestingly, on this one, we have an additional boost in the EQ section, which comes from the sub button. If I press it, we turn the gain up. There's a general low frequency boost when we press the sub button, which lets us allow the low frequencies to still remain quite prominent in our sound. So especially useful for bass sounds or low drum sounds like kick drums or toms and so on. We have saturation here, which has many different flavors to it, which is available from this section here. So we have analog clipping and a hard clipping, where basically it will very dramatically change the shape when we get to the highest volume just before that headroom, or when we hit that headroom with a signal. And then we have all these different kind of more gradual, softer types of distortion. And finally, we have the sinoid fold, which imposes quite an interesting kind of transfer of what goes into what comes out. If we listen to that in this case, quite a kind of musical pitch that it's added into there. And then we have Wave Shaper, which does a similar thing in terms of modifying the actual the output of the signal once it's processed in a way that's not necessarily attached to the musical information going into it. Really good tool for sound design when you want to sort of make something new out of a sound as well. So glue compressor is the final one out of our classics, mainly because it has a similar output as Saturator has, which is this soft clip on and off. So glue compressor, we can turn the soft clipping on, and basically turn the makeup gain into that, which eventually distorts and produces some additional harmonics there. So let's have a look at these in context. So I've got a project here, which is like this. So we have a few different places we can experiment with distortion here. First, we have this kind of background droney sound. So just an atmospheric bed that sits behind the track. If we go for something like overdrive, which has that bandpass filter where we could tune it to work with the sound, we can try and emphasize this background sound in a different frequency area than it actually naturally has, and let the distortion create a new range of frequencies to help that sound come through the mix better. So let's try that with a track. Okay, so that helps it cut through the mix a little bit more. Let's have a look at our kick bass, which is basically an 808 style bass. So it's both serves as the percussive part as well as the sub bass as well. So we go for saturator on here. If we wanted to give it a new character, we could go for the sinoid fold. Maybe go for a dry wet with that. So I've modified the properties to give it a different kind of character, but another thing I can do, let's just get rid of this oscilloscope, is add let's go for amp. And what we're going to do is add some kind of distortion that can sit in the background of this to add another layer of character. Okay, so that's adding both some colour and some kind of thickening to the sound, quite a subtle distortion coming from amp there. And let's also have a look at this drum bus that we've got, sorry, the drum mix that we've got here of all the sounds that aren't the 808 style drum. So let's have a look at the distortion that we've been looking at. Let's go for saturator. Oh, let's go for pedal actually this time, we haven't used that. So what I'm trying to do is create a sense that there's like a wash of the background sound. So by pushing it all up into this distortion, the high and the low parts of the signal are now combined. Harmonics have been added too because it's distortion, so it's reshaping the waveform rather than just adjusting its volume. So I'm creating this kind of distorted wash of sound, and I want to just merge that with the original sound. So I'm going to pull that back to reset my ears, and then I'll blend that in. In fact, I'll put the whole mix back in. Even just a small amount like that can add a lot to the kind of presence and energy of the sounds that you've got going on here. So we've looked at pedal, we've looked at all the other distortions that we've got on our classics folder here. Dynamic tube we haven't actually checked particularly in context yet, so let's just quickly check that on our GABA groove here. So let's just load that in. Let's go for dynamic tube. So you can see it's quite reactive to the volume level and the amount of information that's in the source sound. So I just kind of set that to make sure that it's not too much present in the sound, because it was making it a little bit weaker, but it was adding some variation to the sound over time as well. So as I was saying a minute ago, let's move from the classic sounds that we've now explored, and let's move to our alternative sounds. So some of these are just signposts really for you, just to understand that a couple of other devices in Ableton Live have distortion built into them. So one of them is auto filter. If you look at auto filter, just turn it on, and you go to this section here, which is basically like the emulated circuitry. So the voltage circuits that are inside a lot of classic synthesizers. For their filter stage, Ableton Live has offered those as like modeled versions of them, so trying to get as close as to being true to the originals as possible. And there's these different options of different types of synthesizer filter, and each one of them has an amount of distortion that's available. So again, I can pop that on a sound that maybe we haven't altered yet. Let's go for the elastic lead here. And if I drop that on there, we turn that drive up. Now it reacts with the actual filter position itself, so if you don't want it to do too much to the original sound, make sure the filter's all the way up. But that distortion's quite handy, especially when filtering to create quite a solid enforced sound. This brings me to another thing. It's important to think about your levels going in and out. Now obviously distortion is about abusing levels within a device, but we still want to make sure that subsequent devices are receiving a healthy level of signal for them to react the way that we expect them to. So utility is a good level control. So if you look at the output of auto filter when the drive's turned fully up, peaking. So if I offset this gain control until it no longer peaks out here, I can offset it before it goes into the next part of the signal processing. And now we're out of the reds, and it's much healthier signal for the next device, wherever in the signal chain, for it to receive that signal. So the final things I want to point you to is in analog, which is a synthesizer, we have a distortion stage here, which is like the flavors we've had of sort of traditional saturation, and then looking at the saturation aspects of tube, where tube will be asymmetrical. So we have an asymmetrical section here, and then we have a symmetrical section. It's quite limited. We only have 3 different degrees of the drive that we want for this distortion, but it's handy because it's in there and it's part of the synth and how you can shape your sounds. If we look to operator for a minute, same thing, drop down menu for the filter section, same as auto filter. We can choose those, and then we have a drive control. Interestingly, inside operator, we also have some quite interesting distortion units here, especially the 4-bit, which will lead me to the next device that we talk about, where we're going to reduce the resolution of the waveform in volume to get a crunchy lo-fi kind of sound. So analog and operator have those built in. Let's have a look at Redux. So Redux is basically dropping digital information. That's its job. So if we go for this sound that I've loaded here, and I'll just load in a fresh Redux to that track. What it's going to do is basically change the resolution of the sound. So there's a certain amount of bits that represent the sound, and that's called the bit depth. And this device can basically reduce the amount of bits that there are to represent the waveform in terms of its volume. So the resolution gets dropped, and it's a little bit like a video when you've exported it out, or you're watching it maybe on a poor internet connection, and the picture quality becomes pixelated and blocky. It's similar to that, but it's doing it to audio. It's dropping the resolution of the audio. So just to visually show you that, if I go to the Redux here for a minute, and I start dropping the bit depth, so remember the vertical plane and how many dots can represent the differences in volume, goes from being fairly subtle. And let's just quickly bring the oscilloscope up for a minute, because that helps to visualize this. So it goes from fairly subtle to being eventually quite destructive to the signal. We're starting to hear some very, very digital, non-musically related frequencies coming in there. And we can see from the oscilloscope that the actual waveform is being reduced to such a degree that there's not many sort of resolution points anymore, and then we're getting squaring of what was a pure sine wave. Okay, so that's bit reduction, and then downsampling is similar, but it's on the horizontal plane. So it's the waveform over time. So there's so many samples per second that happen with digital audio, 44.1 thousand samples per second if you're running at 44.1 kilohertz. There'll be that many that run through per second. And what we can do with downsampling is start just chucking some of them away. Now, when they're gone, the waveform will be redrawn with those bits missing, like a dot to dot. Without enough dots, you get quite a jagged looking thing, and that's what will happen to the sound. So if I drop the downsampling here, So we get quite a different type of distortion to the sound, but it is very digital in its nature. Remember, the key thing is it's not musically associated. All the other distortions we looked at have some degree of reacting to the input signal in a way that the harmonics that are being produced are going to have some musical relations to it. With the bit reduction or the downsampling, there's very little, well, there's no association with the input signal. It's just dropping the quality of the file separately from the actual audio going through it. So vinyl distortion we've got in terms of what it can do to our sound. So let's have a quick listen to that. That is definitely more noticeable if we drag it onto another signal. So let's put it on this one. So the top one basically can help us add some musically related even harmonics, which help enforce the original musical pitch of the sound. And the pinch control allows us to go for more odd ones, which give us a more of a hollow, square, wavy kind of sound, like we're seeing where we've seen things going jagged in terms of the waveform change. We've got drive control, and that's the main premise of what we got going on there. So to recap, what we've looked at here is the different types of distortions available within Ableton Live and how the different devices have different kind of characteristics and parameters to be able to modify and shape that behavior as we work.